In the autumn of 1987, a woman named Margaret Holloway discovered a photograph in the attic of a farmhouse she had just purchased in rural Ashland County, Ohio. The house had been abandoned for nearly 4 decades, its previous owners having vanished from local memory like smoke dissipating into cold morning air. The photograph was tucked inside a rotting leather Bible, pressed between the pages of Ecclesiastes, where verses about the futility of earthly pursuits had yellowed with age. The image depicted 2 young men standing on a wooden porch. They wore the plain, dark clothing typical of farming families in the 1880s: wool trousers, suspenders, collarless shirts buttoned to the throat. Their faces were serious, as was customary for photographs of that era, when long exposure times demanded stillness and when smiling for portraits was considered undignified. Behind them, the front door of the farmhouse stood partially open, revealing nothing but darkness within. Margaret Holloway studied the photograph with casual curiosity at first. The 2 brothers, for their resemblance left no doubt of their relation, stood shoulder to shoulder, their postures rigid, their eyes fixed on some point beyond the camera. The taller one, positioned on the left, had a narrow face and deep-set eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The shorter brother, standing to his right, possessed softer features and an expression that might have been melancholy or simply the strain of holding still. It was only when Margaret brought the photograph closer to the window light that she noticed the anomaly. Between the 2 brothers, emerging from the shadows near the doorframe, was a third hand. It rested on the shorter brother's shoulder, fingers splayed, knuckles prominent, the sleeve of a dark jacket visible at the wrist. The hand was unmistakably human, unmistakably real, and unmistakably belonging to neither of the men whose faces appeared in the frame. Margaret turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written 2 names: Ezra and Solomon Whitmore, June 1887. No mention of a third person. No explanation for the hand that touched Solomon's shoulder from the darkness of the doorway. The discovery might have ended there, filed away as a curiosity, perhaps shown to friends over dinner as an amusing oddity. But Margaret Holloway was a retired librarian with a historian's instincts, and the photograph refused to release its grip on her imagination. She began asking questions in the town of Loudonville, the nearest settlement to the old Whitmore farm. She visited the county recorder's office, the historical society, the basement archives of the local newspaper. What she found was not an explanation for the photograph. What she found was silence, a deliberate, cultivated silence that had been maintained for exactly 100 years. The Whitmore family had owned 400 acres of prime farmland in Ashland County since 1842, when Jeremiah Whitmore had migrated from Virginia with his wife, 2 sons, and the modest inheritance from a father who had made his fortune in tobacco. By the 1880s, the family had grown prosperous. They raised cattle and hogs, cultivated wheat and corn, and employed seasonal workers from as far away as Cleveland. They were known as God-fearing people, pillars of the local Methodist congregation, contributors to the fund that built the new schoolhouse in 1879. But when Margaret searched for records of the Whitmore family after 1887, she found almost nothing. The farm had been sold in 1889 to a family named Brennan, who had themselves abandoned it in 1952. No death certificates for Ezra or Solomon appeared in the county records. No marriage records, no birth announcements for children, no obituaries in the Loudonville newspaper. It was as though the 2 brothers in the photograph had simply ceased to exist. The only reference Margaret could find appeared in a single edition of the Ashland County Gazette, dated November 12, 1887. It was a brief notice buried on page 6 between an advertisement for patent medicine and an announcement about a church social. The authorities have concluded their inquiries into the disturbance at the Whitmore farm. No charges will be filed. The family requests privacy during this difficult time. No details. No explanation of what disturbance had occurred. No indication of what had prompted authorities to investigate in the first place. Margaret Holloway spent 3 more months searching for answers. She contacted genealogical societies, wrote letters to distant Whitmore relatives whose addresses she found in census records, visited the graves of 19th-century Loudonville residents in hopes of finding someone who had known the family. Most of her inquiries went unanswered. The few responses she received were variations of the same theme. The Whitmores had left Ohio sometime in the late 1880s, destination unknown, and no one in the family had spoken of them since. One response, however, was different. It came from a 93-year-old woman named Edith Brennan Caldwell, the granddaughter of the family who had purchased the Whitmore farm in 1889. Edith lived in a nursing home in Columbus, and her letter, handwritten in a trembling script, arrived in Margaret's mailbox on a gray December morning. "I was a girl when my grandparents bought that farm," Edith wrote. "My grandmother told me stories about the Whitmores, but only when grandfather wasn't home. She said there had been 3 brothers, not 2. She said the third one had done something terrible, something that made the whole family leave Ohio and never come back. She said the townspeople agreed to forget about it, to never speak the name of the third brother again, because what he had done was too shameful to remember." The letter continued. "I asked her once what the third brother had done. She wouldn't tell me. But she said something I never forgot. She said some sins are so heavy that even the ground won't hold them. They rise up. They reach out. They never stop wanting to be remembered." Margaret read those words 3 times before setting the letter down. She looked again at the photograph, at the 2 brothers standing on the porch, at the hand emerging from the darkness behind them, at the fingers resting on Solomon's shoulder as though in benediction or accusation. And she understood at last that she had not found an anomaly in a photograph. She had found a grave that had never been properly sealed. The story of what happened at the Whitmore farm in 1887 would take Margaret Holloway another 2 years to reconstruct. It would require her to travel to 3 states, to petition for the unsealing of court records that had been classified for a century, to interview the descendants of witnesses who had sworn never to speak of what they had seen. The truth she uncovered would challenge everything she thought she knew about guilt, about family, about the lengths to which ordinary people will go to bury their sins. But every truth begins with a single image. And the image that started this one was a photograph of 2 brothers standing on a porch, with a hand that belonged to neither of them, reaching from the darkness, refusing to let go. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. Stories like this one, stories that history tried to erase, survive only because people like you choose to remember them. Subscribe now and become a witness to the truths that time tried to bury. The Whitmore family Bible, the same one in which Margaret Holloway had found the photograph, contained a genealogical record on its first pages, written in the careful hand of Jeremiah Whitmore himself. It listed births, marriages, and deaths spanning 4 generations, from the family's origins in Hanover County, Virginia, to their settlement in Ohio. Under the heading Children of Jeremiah and Martha Whitmore, 3 names were recorded. Ezra Whitmore, born March 14, 1859. Solomon Whitmore, born August 22, 1861. Caleb Whitmore, born December 3, 1863. The name Caleb had been crossed out. Not once, but repeatedly, the ink pressed so hard into the paper that it had torn through to the page beneath. Someone had wanted that name erased so thoroughly that even the act of crossing it out had become an act of violence. Margaret's research eventually led her to the archives of the Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield, where records from the 1880s had been preserved in filing cabinets that no one had opened in decades. There, in a folder marked Whitmore C. 1884, she found the first concrete evidence of Caleb's existence. Caleb Whitmore had been committed to the reformatory in April of 1884 at the age of 20. The commitment papers, signed by both his father Jeremiah and the county judge, cited moral imbecility and dangerous tendencies. These were common diagnoses in an era when mental illness was poorly understood and often conflated with criminal behavior. But the specific incident that had prompted the commitment was described in clinical detail. On March 29, 1884, Caleb Whitmore had been discovered in the family barn with the body of a neighbor's son, a 12-year-old boy named Thomas Hensley. Thomas had been dead for several hours. The cause of death was strangulation. According to the commitment papers, Caleb had shown no remorse when confronted by his father and the county sheriff. He had simply stated, with a calmness that witnesses described as unnatural, that Thomas had needed to be quiet. When asked what he meant, Caleb had said nothing more. The Hensley family, devastated by their son's death, had demanded justice. They wanted Caleb Whitmore hanged. But Jeremiah Whitmore was a wealthy man with influential friends, and in 1884 a diagnosis of mental incapacity could shield a defendant from criminal prosecution. The county prosecutor agreed to drop charges on the condition that Caleb be committed to the reformatory indefinitely. The Hensleys, lacking the resources to fight a prolonged legal battle, accepted the compromise with bitter reluctance. Caleb Whitmore spent 3 years in the Ohio State Reformatory. The institution's records described him as a model inmate, quiet, obedient, skilled at leatherwork and carpentry. The doctors who examined him noted his intelligence, his apparent recovery, his expressed remorse for what he called the terrible mistake of my youth. By 1887, they recommended his release. Jeremiah Whitmore had died in 1886, leaving the farm to his 2 remaining sons, Ezra, the eldest, had inherited his father's role as head of the family. Solomon, quieter and more bookish, managed the farm's accounts and correspondence. Neither brother had visited Caleb during his time in the reformatory. Neither brother had written to him. For 3 years, they had lived as though they had no third sibling, as though Caleb had died alongside Thomas Hensley in that barn. But in June of 1887, Caleb was released. He had nowhere else to go. The records from this period become fragmentary, pieced together from court documents, newspaper archives, and the faded memories of descendants. What is known is that Caleb returned to the Whitmore farm sometime in early June 1887. What is known is that his brothers did not turn him away, whether out of Christian duty, family obligation, or simple guilt. The historical record does not say. What is also known is that a traveling photographer named William Crane visited the Whitmore farm on June 14, 1887. Crane was an itinerant portraitist who made his living, traveling between rural communities, offering families the chance to preserve their likenesses for posterity. His ledger, preserved in the collections of the Ohio Historical Society, contains an entry for that date: Whitmore Farm, Ashland Co. 2 brothers, porch portrait. $1.50 paid. 2 brothers, not 3, yet the photograph shows 3 hands. The reconstruction of what happened next relies on a document that Margaret Holloway discovered only after years of searching, a handwritten confession, sealed in the records of the Ashland County Probate Court since 1889. The confession had been submitted as evidence in a civil proceeding related to the sale of the Whitmore farm. Its author was Solomon Whitmore. According to Solomon's confession, Caleb had not wanted to appear in the photograph. He had hidden inside the house when William Crane arrived with his camera and tripod, refusing to emerge even when Ezra ordered him to. The shame of his past, the years in the reformatory, the knowledge of what the townspeople thought of him, all of it had made Caleb desperate to remain invisible, to exist as a ghost in his own family home. But as Crane prepared to capture the image, as Ezra and Solomon took their positions on the porch, Caleb had crept to the doorway. He had stood in the shadows just inside the threshold, watching his brothers pose for posterity without him. And in a moment that Solomon would later describe as either impulse or design, Caleb had reached out and placed his hand on Solomon's shoulder. It was a gesture of connection, perhaps forgiveness, perhaps a plea to be included, to be remembered, to be acknowledged as part of the family that had tried so hard to forget him. Crane did not notice the hand in his viewfinder. Ezra and Solomon did not notice it at the time of the photograph. It was only later, when the developed image arrived at the farm, that the brothers saw what Caleb had done. The hand emerging from darkness, the fingers on Solomon's shoulder, the presence that refused to be erased. Solomon's confession describes what happened next in language that is clinical, precise, and utterly devoid of emotion. Ezra became very angry when he saw the photograph. He said Caleb had ruined it, that the image would remind everyone in town of what Caleb was, of what he had done. He said Caleb had no right to touch either of us, not after what he had done to the Hensley boy. They argued. The argument became violent. I tried to intervene, but Ezra was always the stronger of us. When it was over, Caleb was not moving. The date of Caleb's death, according to Solomon's confession, was June 17, 1887, 3 days after the photograph was taken. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. The instrument was a fireplace poker. The perpetrator was Ezra Whitmore. And the witness, the silent, paralyzed witness, was Solomon. The brothers buried Caleb that same night. They wrapped his body in burlap, carried it to a remote corner of the farm, and dug a grave in soil that had never been cultivated. They marked the site with no stone, no cross, no indication that anyone lay beneath the earth. They burned Caleb's clothes, his few possessions, the letters he had written from the reformatory that no one had ever read. Then they went back inside the farmhouse, sat down at the kitchen table, and agreed that Caleb Whitmore had never existed. The photograph was supposed to be destroyed. Ezra had given Solomon explicit instructions to burn it along with everything else. But Solomon could not bring himself to do it. Something in him, guilt, perhaps, or a conscience that would not be silenced, made him hide the photograph instead. He pressed it between the pages of the family Bible, in the section about vanity and the futility of earthly pursuits. And he left it there like a confession that he lacked the courage to speak aloud. For 5 months the brothers maintained their silence. They told neighbors that Caleb had left Ohio to seek work in Pennsylvania. They told the county sheriff, when he came to inquire about Caleb's whereabouts as a condition of his release, that their brother had departed and left no forwarding address. They attended church every Sunday, tithed generously, and spoke to no one about the mound of freshly turned earth in the far corner of their property. But secrets have a weight that compounds over time, and the secret that Ezra and Solomon Whitmore carried was heavier than either of them could bear. In November of 1887, something happened that would shatter the silence forever. The nature of that event and its consequences would determine the fate of the Whitmore family, the judgment of history, and the truth that would remain buried for exactly 100 years. The autumn of 1887 was unseasonably warm in Ashland County, Ohio. Farmers who had expected frost by late October found their fields still soft, their livestock still grazing in pastures that should have been barren. Old-timers called it an Indian summer, a last breath of warmth before the long winter. But some whispered that the heat was unnatural, that the ground was holding on to warmth that should have released, as though something beneath the soil was refusing to let go. On the Whitmore farm, the warmth brought problems that Ezra and Solomon had not anticipated. The grave they had dug in June was shallow, perhaps 3 feet deep, hastily excavated in darkness and fear. At the time, they had been too panicked to dig deeper, too desperate to finish the burial before dawn. They had covered the site with loose soil and fallen leaves, trusting that the remote location would keep their secrets safe. But the warm autumn rains had softened the earth. The soil had settled and shifted, and on the morning of November 8, 1887, a farmhand named Isaac Polk discovered something in the far corner of the Whitmore property that would end the brothers' silence forever. Isaac Polk was a seasonal worker, a freedman from Kentucky who had been employed by the Whitmores for 3 consecutive harvests. He was known in the community as a quiet, reliable man who minded his own business and performed his duties without complaint. On that November morning, he had been sent to repair a section of fence that marked the boundary of the property, a fence that ran directly past the unmarked grave. What Isaac found, protruding from the rain-softened earth, was a human hand. The police report preserved in the Ashland County Archives describes the scene in matter-of-fact language. The remains were partially exposed due to soil erosion and animal activity. The hand and forearm were visible above ground level. Decomposition was advanced but not complete. A burlap wrapping was observed around portions of the remains. Isaac Polk ran nearly 2 miles to the nearest neighbor's farm to report his discovery. By noon, the county sheriff had arrived at the Whitmore property with 2 deputies and the county coroner. By evening, the body had been fully exhumed and transported to the county morgue for examination. Identification was difficult, but not impossible. The body's clothing, what remained of it, included a leather belt with a distinctive brass buckle, the kind issued to inmates at the Ohio State Reformatory. More significantly, dental records from the reformatory matched the teeth of the deceased. The body in the unmarked grave was confirmed to be Caleb Whitmore. Sheriff Thomas Brennan, no relation to the family who would later purchase the farm, arrived at the Whitmore farmhouse that evening with questions that demanded answers. He found Ezra in the parlor, sitting in a chair by the fireplace, staring into flames that had burned down to embers. Solomon was nowhere to be seen. The sheriff's initial interview with Ezra lasted less than an hour. According to the transcript, Ezra maintained a single position throughout. Caleb had left the farm in late June, destination unknown. Ezra had no knowledge of any grave on his property. The body must have been placed there by someone else for reasons unknown. It was a weak defense, and everyone in that parlor knew it. The grave was on Whitmore land, accessible only by crossing Whitmore fields. The body was wrapped in burlap of the kind stored in the Whitmore barn. And Caleb Whitmore had no enemies in Ashland County, no one who would have wanted him dead except perhaps the family that had tried so hard to pretend he did not exist. Sheriff Brennan left the farmhouse that night without making an arrest, but with a clear intention to return. He needed more evidence, a witness, a confession, some concrete proof that would hold up in court. Ezra Whitmore was a wealthy man with connections, and the sheriff knew that any prosecution would face significant obstacles without irrefutable evidence. That evidence arrived the following morning in a form that no one had anticipated. Solomon Whitmore appeared at the sheriff's office at dawn on November 9, 1887. He had walked the 7 miles from the farm to Loudonville in the darkness, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and a single sheet of paper. His face was pale, his hands trembled, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I've come to confess," he said, "not to the crime, but to the silence. And silence before God is its own kind of murder." The document Solomon carried was the confession that Margaret Holloway would discover 100 years later, a handwritten account of everything that had happened on the night of June 17, 1887. It named Ezra as the killer. It described the argument, the violence, the shallow grave in the far corner of the property. It acknowledged Solomon's own complicity as a witness who had said nothing, done nothing, allowed his brother's body to be buried in unhallowed ground without prayer or ceremony. But Solomon's confession contained something else as well, something that would never be made public, something that the court would seal away for a century. It contained Solomon's explanation for why he had finally chosen to speak. Leave a comment saying some silences are heavier than graves. I want to see how many of you understand what Solomon felt in that moment, the weight of carrying a truth that demanded to be spoken. According to Solomon's confession, he had been unable to sleep since the night of Caleb's death. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his brother's hand, not the lifeless hand that Ezra had destroyed, but the living hand that had reached out in the photograph, seeking connection, seeking acknowledgement, seeking to be remembered. The hand had become an obsession, a recurring image that invaded Solomon's dreams and waking hours alike. But it was not the memory of the hand that had finally broken Solomon's silence. It was something far more concrete. On the night of November 7th, 1887, the night before Isaac Polk discovered the grave, Solomon had been sitting alone in the farmhouse parlor. Ezra had gone to bed hours earlier, and the house was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock and the occasional creak of settling timbers. Solomon was reading by lamplight, trying to distract himself from thoughts that would not quiet, and then he heard it. A knock at the front door. 3 knocks, slow and deliberate, spaced several seconds apart. Solomon rose from his chair and crossed to the door. He asked who was there but received no answer. He opened the door and found the porch empty, no visitor, no sign that anyone had been present. The night was still, the moon bright enough to illuminate the yard. Nothing moved. Solomon closed the door and returned to his chair. He convinced himself that he had imagined the sound, that his exhausted mind was playing tricks on him. And then the knock came again. This time Solomon did not open the door. He sat frozen in his chair, listening to the 3 slow knocks repeat themselves, over and over for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. When the sound finally stopped, Solomon rose and walked to the window. Through the glass he saw nothing on the porch. But in the distance, at the far corner of the property, he saw something that made his blood turn to ice. A figure was standing at the edge of the field, tall, motionless, facing the farmhouse. The moonlight was bright enough that Solomon could make out the general shape. A man, standing where no man should have been at that hour, in a location that corresponded exactly to the unmarked grave. Solomon watched the figure for several minutes, unable to move, unable to look away. And then as he watched, the figure raised one hand, slowly, deliberately, and pointed toward the farmhouse, toward Solomon. The figure remained in that position until clouds obscured the moon, plunging the yard into darkness. When the moonlight returned, the field was empty. Solomon did not sleep that night. At dawn, he began walking toward Loudonville, toward the sheriff's office, toward the confession that would end his silence and destroy what remained of his family. The events Solomon described in his confession, the knocking, the figure in the field, were never substantiated by any other witness. Sheriff Brennan noted them in his report, but drew no conclusions from them. The court that eventually heard the case against Ezra Whitmore made no mention of Solomon's strange experience. For the purposes of justice, what mattered was the physical evidence, the body, the grave, the belt buckle, the dental records, and Solomon's testimony about what he had witnessed on the night of June 17, but Solomon himself never wavered in his account. In the final pages of his confession, he wrote words that would remain sealed for 100 years. I do not know what I saw that night. I do not know if the figure was real or a phantom of my guilty conscience, but I know what it meant. It meant that Caleb would not be forgotten. It meant that the hand that reached out in the photograph was still reaching, still demanding acknowledgement, still refusing to let silence be his grave. I could not give him justice, that is beyond my power, but I could give him this, the truth. The truth that he lived, that he died, that he mattered. The truth that even the forgotten have a voice, if someone will only listen. The trial of Ezra Whitmore began in January of 1888 and lasted less than 2 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming, and Solomon's testimony was damning. Ezra maintained his innocence throughout, claiming that Solomon had fabricated the confession out of jealousy and mental instability. But the jury was not persuaded. On January 23, 1888, Ezra Whitmore was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment at the Ohio State Penitentiary. He died there in 1894 of tuberculosis without ever admitting his guilt. Solomon Whitmore was not charged with any crime. The prosecutors determined that his role had been that of a witness rather than a participant, and his willingness to come forward had been essential to securing Ezra's conviction. But Solomon's freedom came at a cost. He was shunned by the community that had once respected his family. Haunted by memories that confession could not erase, and burdened with sole ownership of a farm that had become synonymous with tragedy. In 1889, Solomon sold the farm to a family named Brennan, no relation to the sheriff, and left Ohio forever. He traveled first to Pennsylvania, then to New York, then to destinations unknown. The last verified record of his existence is a letter he wrote to the Ashland County Probate Court in 1891, authorizing the permanent sealing of his confession until such time as the direct. Victims of these events are no longer living. That time came exactly 100 years later, when Margaret Holloway discovered a photograph in a rotting Bible and began asking questions that no one wanted to answer. The story of the Whitmore brothers did not end with Ezra's conviction or Solomon's disappearance. Like all tragedies rooted in family and land, it left echoes that persisted long after the principal actors had departed. These echoes manifested in the lives of those who remained in Ashland County, the neighbors who had known the Whitmores, the descendants who inherited fragments of the story, and the land itself which bore the invisible scars of what had occurred. The Brennan family, who purchased the Whitmore farm in 1889, discovered almost immediately that they had bought more than 400 acres of fertile Ohio farmland. They had inherited a reputation, a history, and a burden that would shape their family for 3 generations. Edgar Brennan was a practical man, a German immigrant who had made his modest fortune in the Cleveland meatpacking industry before deciding to try his hand at agriculture. He knew nothing of the Whitmore tragedy when he signed the purchase papers. The sellers in Columbus had been vague about the property's history, and Edgar had not thought to investigate further. He learned the truth only after moving his wife and 3 children onto the property, when a neighbor named Harold Jennings paid a visit to welcome them and, incidentally, to share the local gossip. "You'll want to stay away from the northeast corner of the property," Jennings advised, his voice carrying the casual tone of someone delivering unremarkable information. "That's where they buried the murdered one. Some folks say the ground there won't grow nothing proper. Others say they've seen lights out there at night moving where no lights ought to be. I don't put much stock in such talk myself, but you should know what people say." Edgar Brennan thanked his neighbor for the information and promptly dismissed it as superstition. He was a man of the industrial age, educated in the sciences, contemptuous of what he called peasant folklore. If the northeast corner of his property was less productive than the rest, it was because the soil composition was different, a matter for agricultural science, not ghost stories. But Edgar's wife, Matilda, was less certain. She had grown up in the Black Forest region of Germany, where respect for the dead was woven into the fabric of daily life. When she learned that an unmarked grave lay on her property, she insisted that something be done not to exorcise spirits, for she was not that sort of believer, but to honor the dead as Christian charity required. In the spring of 1890, Matilda Brennan arranged for a small ceremony at the northeast corner of the property. A Methodist minister from Loudonville, the same denomination the Whitmores had belonged to, agreed to perform a brief service. A simple wooden cross was erected to mark the site. Prayers were said for the soul of Caleb Whitmore, whose sins in life were acknowledged, but whose death by violence was deemed deserving of Christian commemoration. The ceremony was attended by exactly 4 people: Edgar and Matilda Brennan, the minister, and Harold Jennings, who had agreed to serve as a witness. No members of the Whitmore family were present. There were none left in Ohio to attend. No members of the Hensley family were present either, though they had been invited. The Hensleys had never forgiven Caleb for the murder of their son, and they were not prepared to offer prayers for his soul no matter how he had died. The wooden cross Matilda erected lasted approximately 15 years before weather and rot reduced it to splinters. It was never replaced. By the time Edgar Brennan died in 1912, the exact location of Caleb's grave had become uncertain, somewhere in the northeast corner near the old fence line, but the precise spot was no longer marked or remembered. Matilda lived until 1928, and in her final years she often spoke to her grandchildren about the Whitmore tragedy. Her accounts were fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, colored by decades of retelling and the inevitable embellishments of memory. But certain details remained consistent: the photograph with the extra hand, the confession that had sent Ezra to prison, the figure Solomon claimed to have seen in the field on the night before the grave was discovered. One detail that Matilda added, a detail that appears in no official record, was a claim about the photograph itself. According to Matilda, the photograph of the Whitmore brothers had been copied before Solomon left Ohio. The original had been submitted as evidence during Ezra's trial and was supposedly destroyed afterward, as was customary for exhibits in criminal cases. But a copy had been made by whom Matilda did not know, and that copy had remained in the farmhouse when the Brennans took possession. Matilda claimed that she had seen the copy with her own eyes in the winter of 1890. She described it as identical to the original in every respect, including the hand emerging from the darkness behind the two brothers. But she also claimed something else, something that her grandchildren found difficult to believe. She claimed that the hand in the photograph had moved. Not dramatically, not obviously, but perceptibly. In the original image, or so Matilda believed, the hand had rested on Solomon's right shoulder, fingers splayed, palm flat against the fabric of his shirt. But in the copy that Matilda examined that winter, the hand seemed to have shifted position. The fingers were now curled slightly, as though in the act of gripping rather than resting. The palm seemed angled differently. The thumb, previously visible, was now hidden behind Solomon's shoulder. Matilda showed the photograph to her husband, who dismissed her observation as imagination. "Photographs don't change," Edgar said, with the confidence of a man who understood chemistry and optics. "The image is fixed at the moment of exposure. What you're seeing is a trick of light, nothing more." But Matilda was not convinced. She put the photograph back in the Bible where she had found it, and she never looked at it again. The photograph remained in that Bible for nearly a century, passed down through generations of Brennans who never examined it closely, never noticed the anomaly, never connected the faded image to the tragedy that had occurred on their land. It was Margaret Holloway, an outsider, a newcomer, a woman with a librarian's curiosity and a historian's persistence, who finally brought the photograph back into the light. Margaret spent 2 years reconstructing the Whitmore story, traveling to archives in 3 states, petitioning courts for sealed records, interviewing descendants who had only fragments of the truth. Her research culminated in a privately published book released in 1989, titled The Hand in the Doorway, A True Account of the Whitmore Tragedy. The book received little attention at the time. It was printed in a limited run of 500 copies, distributed primarily to libraries and historical societies. Reviews were respectful but muted. The story was too obscure, too regional, too remote from contemporary concerns to generate widespread interest. But among those who read it, the book had a profound effect. Several descendants of the original participants contacted Margaret after the book's publication. Some thanked her for documenting a history their families had tried to forget. Others criticized her for dredging up painful memories that should have been left buried. A few offered additional information, letters, diaries, photographs that filled in gaps Margaret had been unable to resolve. One letter, however, stood out from the rest. It came from a man named David Whitmore, who claimed to be a great-great-grandson of Solomon Whitmore. David lived in Oregon, where Solomon had apparently settled after leaving New York in the 1890s, according to David. Solomon had lived until 1923, dying at the age of 62 in a small town outside Portland. He had never married, never had children of his own, but he had been close to a nephew, the son of a distant cousin, and it was through that nephew that the Whitmore line had continued. David Whitmore possessed something that Margaret had been unable to find in any archive: Solomon's personal diary from the years 1887 to 1891. The diary had been passed down through the family as a curiosity, never read carefully, never understood in context. David had inherited it from his grandfather, who had inherited it from his father, who had received it from Solomon himself shortly before Solomon's death. When David read Margaret's book, he realized for the first time what the diary might contain. He sent Margaret a photocopy of the relevant pages, along with a letter that expressed both gratitude and apprehension. "I don't know what to make of what my ancestor wrote," David's letter said. "Some of it matches what you documented in your book, but some of it goes further, much further. I'm not sure I believe it, but I think you should see it and decide for yourself what it means." The diary pages David sent covered the period from June 1887 to February 1888, from the month of Caleb's death to the weeks following Ezra's conviction. But scattered among these ordinary notations were passages of a very different character. June 18, 1887, the day after Caleb's death, contained a single sentence: "It is done. God forgive us." June 25, 1887, 1 week later: "I cannot stop seeing his hand, not the dead hand, but the living one. The one that reached out, the one that touched my shoulder. I feel it there still, even now. I will always feel it." July 14, 1887. Ezra says we must forget. He says Caleb brought this on himself, that what happened was justice, not murder. I want to believe him, but at night when the house is quiet I hear the floorboards creak in the hallway. I hear footsteps that belong to no one. I hear 3 knocks at the door, and when I open it, no one is there. August 3rd, 1887. The photograph arrived today. Ezra wanted to burn it immediately. I told him I would do it, but I could not. The hand in the picture, Caleb's hand, it seems more real to me than my own. It is the only proof that he existed, the only evidence that he was ever part of this family. How can I destroy the last trace of my brother's life? September 19th, 1887. I showed the photograph to Ezra tonight. I had hidden it in the Bible, but he found it somehow. He demanded to know why I had kept it. I could not explain. He took the photograph and threw it into the fire. I watched it burn, but afterward, when I opened the Bible to pray, the photograph was there again, in the same place, unburned. I do not understand. October 31st, 1887. All Hallows Eve. The neighbors are telling stories about spirits returning from the dead. I used to laugh at such tales. I cannot laugh anymore. Last night I dreamed of Caleb standing in the doorway of my bedroom. He did not speak. He only raised his hand and pointed at me, the same gesture I saw in the field. I woke with his name on my lips. November 7th, 1887. The night before Isaac Polk discovered the grave, the knocking came again tonight. 3 knocks, then silence. 3 knocks, then silence. I went to the window and saw him, or something that looked like him, standing at the edge of the field. He pointed at me. He pointed at the house. He pointed at the place where we buried him. I know now what I must do. Silence is a kind of murder, and I have been silent long enough. The diary entries after Solomon's confession are more fragmentary, more confused. He writes of relief mixed with terror of the trial that consumed his days and the nightmares that consumed his nights. He writes of Ezra's hatred expressed through glances across the courtroom and whispered curses in the corridor. He writes of his decision to leave Ohio, to leave behind everything he had known, to start again in a place where no one knew the name Whitmore or the sins associated with it. The final entry Margaret received was dated February 15th, 1888, 3 weeks after Ezra's conviction. I leave tomorrow for Pennsylvania. I do not know if I will ever return to Ohio. I do not know if the memories will follow me or if distance will bring peace. But I know this. Caleb is not gone. Not truly. The hand that reached out in the photograph is still reaching. The voice that I silenced is still speaking. Some sins cannot be buried deep enough. Some truths cannot be erased. In some hands, once they touch you, never let go. The question of what Solomon Whitmore experienced during those months in 1887, the knocking, the figure in the field, the photograph that seemingly could not be destroyed, has never been definitively answered. Skeptics have proposed explanations rooted in psychology: the guilt of a witness to murder, the stress of maintaining a terrible secret, the power of imagination to manifest fears in concrete forms. These explanations are reasonable, supported by what is known about the effects of trauma on perception and memory, but they do not account for everything. Margaret Holloway, in the years following the publication of her book, continued to investigate the Whitmore case. She corresponded with David Whitmore, with descendants of the Brennan family, with historians and psychologists who offered competing interpretations of the evidence. She visited the site of the old Whitmore farm multiple times, though by the 1990s little remained of the original structures. The farmhouse had burned in 1954, and the land had been parceled and sold to various owners. In 1993, Margaret made a discovery that would become the final chapter of her investigation. She was contacted by an antiques dealer in Cleveland who had acquired a collection of 19th century photographs from an estate sale. Among the photographs was an image that the dealer thought might be of interest, given Margaret's published work on the Whitmore family. The photograph showed 2 young men standing on a wooden porch. Margaret drove to Cleveland the following day. What she found in the dealer's shop confirmed her suspicion and deepened the mystery at the same time. The photograph was clearly a copy of the original Whitmore image. The same 2 brothers, the same porch, the same partially open door behind them. But it was not identical to the image Margaret had found in the Bible years earlier. In the original photograph, the hand emerging from the darkness had rested on Solomon's right shoulder, finger splayed, palm flat. In the copy Margaret now held, the hand had moved. It was no longer resting on Solomon's shoulder. It was gripping the back of Solomon's neck, fingers curled, knuckles white with pressure. The sleeve of the jacket was more visible now, extending further from the doorway, and in the darkness behind the door, barely perceptible but unmistakably present, was the suggestion of a face. Pale, indistinct, with eyes that seemed to be looking directly at the camera. Margaret stared at the photograph for a long time. She compared it to reproductions of the original image in her book. The differences were undeniable. She asked the antiques dealer where the photograph had come from. The dealer consulted his records and found that it had been part of an estate sale in Loudonville, Ohio, property belonging to a family named Jennings. The name meant something to Margaret. Harold Jennings had been the neighbor who warned Edgar Brennan about the grave on the Whitmore property. Harold Jennings had attended the small ceremony when Matilda erected a cross to mark Caleb's resting place. The Jennings family, it seemed, had possessed their own copy of the Whitmore photograph for over a century. Margaret purchased the photograph and brought it home. She examined it under magnifying glasses, compared it to the original using digital imaging software, consulted experts in 19th century photography who confirmed that the image was genuine, not a modern forgery. Not a double exposure, but an authentic photographic print from the 1880s. No one could explain the differences between the two images. Some suggested that William Crane, the traveling photographer, had taken multiple exposures on that June day in 1887, that the original and the copy were actually two separate photographs, captured seconds apart, showing slightly different arrangements. This explanation was plausible but incomplete. It accounted for minor variations in posture, but not for the dramatic change in the hand's position, not for the face emerging from the darkness, not for the sense of movement that the second image conveyed. Others proposed more exotic theories. They spoke of spirit photography, a practice popular in the Victorian era, in which unscrupulous photographers manipulated their images to suggest the presence of ghosts. Perhaps William Crane had been such a practitioner, they suggested. Perhaps the hand in the photograph had always been an intentional addition, a trick of darkroom technique designed to prey on the superstitions of rural customers. But this theory, too, had problems. There was no evidence that William Crane had ever engaged in spirit photography. His ledger contained no entries suggesting such services. And the hand in the photograph was not transparent or ethereal, as spirit images typically appeared. It was solid, material, undeniably real. Margaret never published her discovery of the second photograph. She felt that it raised more questions than it answered, and she was reluctant to invite the kind of sensationalist attention that such a revelation might attract. Instead, she included a brief mention in a revised edition of her book, released in 1995, noting only that additional photographic evidence has come to light that may complicate the accepted interpretation of the Whitmore case. She died in 2003, leaving her research materials to the Ashland County Historical Society. Among those materials was the second photograph, along with a handwritten note in which Margaret offered her own tentative conclusion. I do not know what happened at the Whitmore farm in 1887. I do not know if Caleb, Whitmore's spirit, lingered after death, demanding acknowledgement, refusing to be forgotten. I am a historian, not a theologian, and I have no expertise in matters of the supernatural. But I know what I have seen in these photographs. I know that something changed between the first image and the second. I know that the hand that rested on Solomon's shoulder eventually gripped his neck, and I know that a face emerged from the darkness that was not there before. Perhaps these changes are artifacts of different exposures, different copies, different moments in time. Perhaps they are tricks of light and chemistry, explainable by science if only we knew the right questions to ask. Or perhaps Matilda Brennan was right. Perhaps photographs can change, given enough time and enough need. Perhaps the dead, when they are forgotten, find ways to make themselves remembered. Perhaps Caleb Whitmore, erased from the family Bible, excluded from the portrait, buried in an unmarked grave, found a way to insert himself into history despite every effort to erase him. I cannot prove any of this. I can only present the evidence and let others draw their own conclusions. But I will say this: since I began this research, I have never felt alone. There is a presence in this work, call it imagination, call it projection, call it whatever you like, that I cannot shake. When I look at the photograph of the Whitmore brothers, I feel that I am being watched. When I read Solomon's diary, I feel that I am being addressed. When I visit the site of the old farm, I feel that someone is waiting for me to arrive. Perhaps this is only the effect of immersing myself too deeply in a tragic story. Perhaps my mind has created phantoms where none exist. But sometimes, late at night, I hear 3 knocks at my door, and when I open it, no one is there. The Whitmore farm no longer exists as a recognizable place. The land has been subdivided, developed, transformed by decades of change, where the farmhouse once stood. There is now a small housing development, modest homes with aluminum siding and chain-link fences, occupied by families who know nothing of the history beneath their feet. Where the barn once stood, there is a strip mall with a convenience store and a pizza restaurant. Where Caleb Whitmore was buried, there is a parking lot. But the story persists. It persists in the archives of the Ashland County Historical Society, where Margaret Holloway's research materials are preserved in acid-free folders and temperature-controlled storage. It persists in the rare copies of her book that circulate among collectors of regional history and true crime. It persists in the memories of the Whitmore descendants scattered across the country, who carry fragments of the story without fully understanding its weight. And it persists in the photographs, both the original, which remains in the collection of the Historical Society, and the second copy, which hangs in a small museum in Loudonville dedicated to the county's darker chapters. Visitors to that museum sometimes report unusual experiences. They speak of feeling watched when they stand before the photograph. They describe a sensation of coldness that seems to emanate from the image, despite the climate-controlled environment of the gallery. A few have claimed to see movement in the photograph, a shift in the hand's position, a change in the expression on the brothers' faces, though these claims have never been verified. The museum's curator, a woman named Patricia Holloway Ross, no relation to Margaret Holloway, dismisses such reports as the products of suggestion and expectation. People come here looking for ghosts, she has said in interviews. They want to see something strange, so they convince themselves that they do. The photograph is just a photograph, a moment frozen in time, nothing more. But Patricia also admits to her own unsettling experience with the Whitmore photograph. In 2018, during a routine inventory of the museum's collection, she removed the photograph from its frame to examine the back for documentation purposes. What she found there had never been recorded in any previous catalog. Someone had written on the back of the photograph in pencil and handwriting that appeared to date from the late 19th century. The writing was faint, barely legible, but Patricia was eventually able to make out the words, "3 brothers stood here once. 2 were seen. 1 was forgotten. But the forgotten one remembers. The forgotten one reaches. The forgotten one will never stop." There was no signature, no date, no indication of who had written the message or when. Patricia showed the inscription to colleagues, to historians, to handwriting experts. No one could identify the author with certainty. Some suggested it might have been Solomon, adding a final note to the image before he left Ohio. Others thought it might have been Matilda Brennan, leaving a warning for future owners. Still others proposed that it was a later edition, written by someone who had heard the story and wanted to embellish the artifact's mystique. The truth remains unknown. What is known, what can be verified through documents and testimony and physical evidence, is this. In June of 1887, 3 brothers lived on a farm in Ashland County, Ohio. One of them had committed a terrible crime years earlier and had been institutionalized for it. When he was released and returned to his family, he was treated as a ghost, present but unacknowledged, alive but unwanted. On the day a photographer came to capture the family's image, the 3rd brother hid in the shadows. But at the moment the photograph was taken, he reached out and placed his hand on his brother's shoulder, a gesture of connection, of longing, of desperate desire to be included in the family that had rejected him. 3 days later he was dead, killed by his older brother in a fit of rage over that very photograph. He was buried in an unmarked grave, his name crossed out of the family Bible, his existence erased from official records. But the photograph remained. And in that photograph his hand remained as well, reaching from the darkness, refusing to let go, demanding to be seen. The story of Caleb Whitmore is, in many ways, a story about memory. It is about what happens when we try to forget the inconvenient dead, the shameful relations, the family members whose sins reflect poorly on those who survive them. It is about the impossibility of true erasure, the way the past persists, surfacing when we least expect it, demanding acknowledgement, refusing to be buried. Solomon Whitmore understood this truth in the end. He understood that his silence was a kind of murder, that by refusing to speak Caleb's name, he was killing his brother a second time. His confession was an act of resurrection, not of the body, but of the memory, the identity, the simple fact of existence that Caleb's life and death represented. The hand in the photograph was Caleb's final message to the world. It said, "I was here. I existed. I mattered. Do not forget me." And for over a century, the world did forget. The records were sealed, the land was sold, the name was erased. But the photograph survived. And eventually a woman named Margaret Holloway found it, studied it, and understood what it meant. She brought Caleb back into the light. She gave him a place in history. She made sure that the hand reaching from the darkness was finally seen. This is the power of stories like this one. They remind us that the dead are never truly gone as long as someone remembers them. They teach us that erasure is never permanent, that truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deeply it is buried. They challenge us to look into the darkness and acknowledge what we find there, not with fear, but but with compassion. Caleb Whitmore was not a good man. He committed a terrible crime, and he deserved to face justice for it. But he did not deserve to be erased. He did not deserve to be buried without ceremony, without prayer, without even a name to mark his grave. He was a human being, flawed and broken and capable of evil, but human nonetheless. And every human being deserves to be remembered. The hand in the photograph is still reaching. It will always be reaching. As long as the image exists, as long as people look at it and wonder about the story behind it, Caleb Whitmore will continue to touch the world of the living. Perhaps that is what he wanted all along. Not forgiveness, that was beyond his reach. Not redemption, he had forfeited that with his crimes. Just acknowledgement. Just the simple recognition that he had existed, that he had lived and died, that his presence had mattered to someone, somewhere, at some point in time. The photograph gives him that, and perhaps in the end it is enough. The Whitmore farm is gone now, replaced by homes and businesses and parking lots. The people who live there do not know the history of the land beneath their feet. They do not know about the brothers who stood on a porch, about the hand that reached from the shadows, about the grave that was discovered on a warm November morning. But the story survives, in archives and books and museums, in the memories of descendants and the curiosity of strangers. The story of Caleb Whitmore continues to be told. And somewhere, in a photograph that has survived for nearly 140 years, a hand continues to reach from the darkness. It is the hand of a forgotten brother, demanding to be remembered. It is the hand of a silenced voice, demanding to be heard. It is the hand of the past, reaching into the present, refusing to let go. Some say that if you look at the photograph long enough, you can feel it, a pressure on your shoulder, a touch from across the years, a connection that transcends time and death. Some say that Caleb Whitmore is still waiting, still hoping, still reaching for the acknowledgement he was denied in life. Some say that the hand in the photograph will keep moving century after century until someone finally takes it. But what do you believe? If you've watched this far, it's because you've felt the weight of this story, the weight of silence, the weight of memory, the weight of a hand that refused to let go. Leave a comment saying I've watched this far, so I can see who among you truly understands that some stories demand to be heard. Your comment tells me that you're part of this community, the witnesses who refuse to let the forgotten stay forgotten. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the power of memory and the persistence of truth, please leave a like. It helps more people find these hidden histories. And if you know someone who appreciates stories that challenge them, that stay with them long after they end, share this video with them. Some truths are too important to keep to ourselves. Finally, if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. Stories like this one, stories that history tried to erase, survive only because people like you choose to remember them. By subscribing, you become part of something larger, a community dedicated to uncovering the truths that time tried to bury. Until next time, remember, the past is never truly past. It waits. It reaches. And sometimes, if we're brave enough to look, it touches us across the years.